Thank you very much. So let me just ask, how many people here would like to avoid Alzheimer's disease? Yeah. Me too. And how many people here know they're fasting insulin? Okay. Yeah, maybe 10, 15 people. Great. And how many people here know their C4A? Okay, a few people. Okay. How many know their ApoE status? Fantastic. This is the one that James Watson said he did not want to know. When he had the first genome sequenced, which was his genome, by the way, he said, I do not want to know my ApoE status because that's something I can do nothing about. And of course, he was actually wrong. There's a tremendous amount that can actually be done about that, as we'll talk about today. So Alzheimer's disease is really the white whale. It's the thing that we as physicians have been after for 114 years, since Dr. Alzheimer first described it in 1906, without much success. And so we've been looking at what actually can be done here. This is from a flight I had to London about a year ago. And on that flight, you can see this is a story about a guy who is one of the very first Concorde pilots. And he committed suicide. Why did he commit suicide? Because he had just killed his wife. Why did he kill his wife? Because she had Alzheimer's disease, and he couldn't bear to watch her go downhill. This is the sort of thing that's happening that we need to stop. There are about 50 people in this auditorium right now who will die of Alzheimer's disease if we don't do something about it. So this is a huge issue and one that we all need to deal with. So at the same time, this is a story about much more than Alzheimer's disease. It's a story about how we change. It's a story about what it takes to convince people that what an expert is telling them may actually be wrong, that maybe our system needs to change. We have all heard about disruption in Silicon Valley. We hear about Facebook, we hear about Twitter, we hear about WhatsApp, all of these various things that are disruptive, and we get used to this in Silicon Valley. This disruption is beginning to spread into medicine. But medicine, of course, is very different. It's been historically about tradition and permission. Hippocrates said, teach the children. It goes from generation to generation. And so medicine is controlled by the pharmaceutical industry, right? By the healthcare companies, and by the people who teach us, the medical schools, the American Medical Association. And there's a lot of pushback to this beginning of revolution, and I'll show you part today. So as an example, I just got an email a few minutes ago from a guy in Texas who has gone on the protocol that I'll show you in a few minutes, and his wife has gotten better. And he went to an Alzheimer's caregiver group and said, I'd like to mention my wife. And they said, we will not allow you, if you come into this group, to mention that your wife got better. So there's control for anything that's considered disruptive in medicine. And you can understand to some extent because medicine, of course, is about first do no harm. Primum non nocere is what we learn in medical school. But in fact, when you've got something like Alzheimer's where there has been nothing, then you need to think about disruption. You need to think about change. So this really is a story about much more than just Alzheimer's disease. It's about how our country is changing in the way we embrace disruption and how you actually change people's thinking. So here's a typical story. What do? We wait for symptoms to appear. We go to see the doctor. The doctor may spend 10 minutes with us. It depends on what the healthcare group allows that doctor to do. In general, the patient is considered to be passive. And how many people have said to their doctor, well, I'd like to show you something that I read or that I got on Google, and the doctor has said, don't bother me with this. They want us typically to be passive. And in fact, there's a mug that you may have seen in many doctors' offices that says, your Google search does not equal my medical degree. Right? So the involvement by the patient is often seen as interference, when in fact, You know more about yourself than the doctor does. And then what does the doctor do? When you go in and you say, I'm having trouble with my memory, or I'm having trouble thinking, the doctor checks a very tiny data set. Typically, he or she will check your sodium, your potassium, may check your thyroid, may check your B12, but doesn't check the very things that are actually contributing to your cognitive decline. And then says to you, well, you've got Alzheimer's, there's nothing we can do. Then he gives you a drug. It's a monotherapeutic. And as I'll show you, this actually makes no biological sense when you understand what Alzheimer's actually is. So the doctor will give you this drug and tell you it's probably not going to work very well, and typically it doesn't. No surprise. And guess what? Once you've gone in there and your doctor has written in your chart memory problems or possible Alzheimer's, you will not be able to purchase long-term care insurance. And in fact, patient 0 that I described in the book came to me because she was going to commit suicide because she had been unable to get long-term care insurance. What happens then over time, the medicine doesn't work. You progress to a nursing home, it's very high expense, you destroy the family's finances, and finally you die destitute. This is unfortunately Alzheimer's in our best situation today. This is the sadness of what Alzheimer's actually is. And here's why that is. Because it's a fundamentally different disease. Here's the thing. When you look at 20th century diseases, like pneumonia, like TB, they had a certain way. So let's look at pneumonia as an example. If you're going to get pneumonia, you're probably going to do pretty well because we have penicillin and amoxicillin and cephalosporins to treat you. But when you get that, whether you have alcohol on board actually changes your risk for getting pneumonia. Whether you have diabetes, for example, changes your risk. Whether you have your B cells, which are the ones that make the antibodies, if your B cells are not functioning very well, for example, if you have multiple myeloma, then in fact you are at increased risk for pneumonia. But guess what? There are lots of other things, but it's so much more important than anything else, whether you have the pneumococcus itself, that we as physicians have gotten away with giving you a prescription that attacks only this one variable without thinking about those other variables. That's great. And in fact, the great success of 20th century medicine was to combine public health measures and antibiotics to cure many of these simple illnesses. The problem is that now we are all dying of complex chronic illnesses, neurodegenerative conditions, cancer, cardiovascular disease. These are fundamentally different than the simple illnesses like pneumococcal pneumonia. Therefore, we as physicians have been using our checkers strategy for a chess match. Let's look at Alzheimer's. Whether you have insulin resistance is very important for your risk for Alzheimer's. Whether you have specific pathogens such as Candida, such as Borrelia, such as herpes simplex from your lip, such as P. gingivalis from your dentition. NF-kappa B is what is activated in your body when you have inflammation. So as they call it, inflammaging. Many of us, so many of us, have ongoing inflammation. And in fact, that increases our risk markedly for Alzheimer's disease. Mercury turns out to be important in whether you're going to get Alzheimer's or not. And of course, it's said in most cases it's not a big player. Yes, but in some cases it's a very important player. Whether you have specific mycotoxins, who knew? These are toxins from molds. So many of us live in moldy homes, and for many molds it's not going to be a problem, but specific molds actually produce toxins that can give you Alzheimer's disease and other illnesses as well. Specific organic toxins, toluene, benzene, formaldehyde. In fact, if you look at the people who were the first responders in the World Trade Center, we all know that the first responders got terrible lung diseases, often got cancer, but guess what else they've gotten? It's turning out that they are becoming demented. And 12.8% of the first responders already by 2015 had cognitive decline. So this is a huge problem. What are the fires in California going to do to all of us? They have increased our risk for Alzheimer's disease. So these are critical. Homocysteine is another one. This is about your ability to methylate. So it turns out that there are dozens and dozens of these critical factors that will tell us our risk for Alzheimer's disease and our risk for cognitive decline. We want to know all of them. And as you can see, unlike with the simple illness, there's not a single one that is the critical one. So therefore, we can hit one or two of these. It really doesn't do a lot for you. That's been the problem. Therefore, what do you think happens when we try to go after a drug that just has a single mechanism? And in fact, drugs that typically don't even hit why we're getting it. Here are just a few of the many failures. In 1 decade, there were 244 clinical trials for Alzheimer's at a cost of billions. 243 failed outright, and the one that succeeded, which was memantine, had an absolutely minimal effect on the disease. This one here, semigacistat, in the middle on the top there. Semigacistat came from Lilly. It cost over $500 million to get this thing developed and tested. Not only did it not make Alzheimer's better, it actually made it worse. So it's worse than taking water for Alzheimer's disease. Now, this was developed by very smart people working for a lot of years, very hard to develop this. So something is fundamentally wrong with the way we are thinking about this disease when we have failed again and again and again. So we really need a paradigm shift. We need some disruption to think about this disease and develop the right things for it. So the current standard of care here is that, in the current standard of thought about Alzheimer's, is that there's something that causes it. We don't know what it is, but there's something that causes it. It's one disease, and there's one treatment. It's a monotherapy, and it's ineffective. But that's not what the research shows. So my laboratory studied Alzheimer's disease for 3 decades, and what we found is that there are many contributors to this. We identified initially 36. There are a few more now, but it's not thousands. There are dozens of things, like the ones I just showed you, that contribute to this disease. There are multiple subtypes. It's not just one disease. We see people who have a more inflammatory type Alzheimer's. We see people who have a more toxic type of Alzheimer's. We see people who have a more atrophic type of Alzheimer's. So each person is a little different, and therefore we need a precision medicine protocol, a personalized protocol that targets the things that are actually causing that. And that's the approach that we've taken, and we've had unprecedented improvements in people. What this means then is that if you were to go out and develop the perfect Alzheimer's drug, this is what it would have to look like. So this is what it would have to do. And you can see this is a really tall order for a single drug. Therefore, we believe that going forward, it's going to be about a drug plus an overall personalized program that will actually hit the things that are causing it. If you have HSV, which is herpes simplex, as one of the causes, you better be treating that herpes simplex. If you've got a specific mycotoxin like the trichothecenes or ochratoxin A, and that's contributing to your cognitive decline, then we better be targeting that as well. So here, let me just show you a few examples. So this is a woman that was 67 actually when she first came to see me in 2012. And she's just actually turned 75. And so her mother died with dementia. Very typical story. Unable to navigate on the freeway, couldn't remember what she'd read, unable to prepare reports for her work. She works for the US government, and she simply could not prepare reports for her work. She couldn't even remember 4-digit numbers. She had a retinal scan that was positive for amyloid, greater than the positive control, who was a patient who had familial Alzheimer's, was actually very rare, less than 5% of the overall patients. And, oops, there we go. And so at that time, we had been doing research in the lab. We had been working with mice, and we had been working with cells and all the models of Alzheimer's disease. And so I got this call. This woman was going to come out from the East Coast, and I said, well, wait a minute, I haven't seen a patient in 20 years. I'm working on mice. If you have Alzheimer's, I can probably help you, right? But if you're a human being, I don't know if I can help you or not. Well, we had just actually in 2011 applied to be allowed to do the first clinical trial in history in which, instead of just using a predetermined single drug, we would actually look for each person and what was going to cause the problem, and then we would address all of those different things. And we were actually turned down to do this. They said, you can't do this, it's multiple variables. We said, well, yeah, but that's what the disease is. The disease is multivariables. They said, that's not the way clinical trials work. So the whole idea of a clinical trial goes against what Alzheimer's disease actually is. So we had just been turned out from this. I got this call from this woman, and I said, okay, well, I'm happy to see the woman, but I can only tell her what we were going to do in the trial. So we spent 2.5 hours in my lab up at the Buck Institute looking through all the different issues, and she was taking notes with all this sort of stuff. And then I said, look, take it back to your doctor back on the East Coast. And, I thought I would never hear from her again. Well, 3 months later, on a Saturday at our home, I got a call from this woman, and I picked up the phone, and she said, I can't believe it. I'm better than I've been in 20 years with my memory. I'm back at work. I'm doing great. And I thought, oh my gosh, I put down the phone and I turned to my wife, who's an integrative physician herself, and who had told me, whatever you guys find in the lab, it's going to have something to do with basics. What you're eating, what you're exposed to, whether you're exercising, whether you're sleeping, all these sorts of things. And of course, I had said to her 20 years before that, no. We're going to find one molecule with one fold, one region, and we're going to be able to develop a drug for that one thing, and that's going to solve the problem. Of course, I should have listened to my wife 20 years ago, because she turned out to be absolutely right. These are the things that actually drive this. So this woman called and said, I'm doing so much better. I had lunch with her just 3 days ago, and she is doing great, and she has become a brain health coach, and she now works on our protocol. So she came back, and she came back actually to see me after a year. And I said, do you mind if I take a little video of you? And she said, as long as you don't use my name. And now you'll see that her face is pixelated out because she's still working. And the U.S. government sends her all over the world. And of course, she doesn't want people to know that she was treated for Alzheimer's disease. And she talks a little bit about her story here. And by the way, she's just written a book, which should be out in about a year or so.
So tell me a little bit about how things were a year ago.
Well, a year ago, I was having a lot of difficulty. I was very frustrated because my memory was poor. I had issues of being spatially disoriented, particularly when I was driving. I would get off the freeway at the wrong exit or not know where I was getting back on familiar routes. I would reach in my house for a light switch. I'd reach on the wrong wall, even though I'd always had the light switch has always been on the right side. I'd start reaching to the left. I call my animals a different name, my pets, and I was really worried about it. I was very stressed about it. So it was a very stressful time.
And how are things at work?
I have a job that requires a lot of mental analysis, a lot of thinking. I do a lot of research. I have to collect data and design the study and then do the analysis and write a report, usually under pressure. And I was finding that I just couldn't complete an assignment. I couldn't think about the analysis. It was just a jumble to me, and I would start procrastinating and putting it off, and the longer I put it off, the more stress I felt. So I was worried that I was not going to be able to continue with my career.
And tell me a little bit about how things are now.
Things are much improved now. My memory is much better. In fact, I would even go so far as to say I don't think that I have a problem with memory now, which is a great surprise to me from where I was a year ago. My thinking, cognitive ability, and ability to do work, ability to do reports, I am back into the stream of things, being productive and being able to do my analysis and writing, which is fantastic.
And how's the driving?
Driving, no problem. I drive at night, I drive in the daytime, I know where to get off, where to get on. I'm on the highway, so I feel like that's a problem. I'm not reaching for the wrong side of the room for the light switch. I'm not calling my pets the wrong name, which I think they're probably grateful for.
And how overall are you feeling?
I feel great. I feel really, really good. I feel energetic. I feel more peaceful and calm about my life, but at the same time very enthusiastic. I've even started writing my book.
Fantastic.
A couple of chapters.
Okay, thank you very much.
So here's another guy that actually started December of 2013, and his wife brought him to me because he had done what many people do. He had gone off the cliff. He had been starting down, and he actually had documented his decline over several years. And he has the ApoE4 gene. How many people know their ApoE status again? Okay, so maybe 5%, something like that. So this is something that is present. If you have 0 copies, which is the majority, about 3/4 of the population, your chance during your lifetime of getting Alzheimer's is about 9%. It's not 0, but it's not too high. If you have 1 copy of ApoE4, which is what he had, then your chance during your lifetime of developing Alzheimer's is about 30%. If you have 2 copies, and I should say 1 copy, that's 75 million Americans. And most of them don't know they have that until they start to have problems. So very important to find out and get on active prevention. If you have 2 copies, that's 7 million Americans. Then in fact your chance is well over 50%. Most likely during your lifetime you will develop Alzheimer's disease. So again, important to be on appropriate prevention. And you can see here, he improved here in multiple neuropsychiatric tests. You can see here his auditory delayed memory dramatically improved, his California verbal learning test dramatically improved, reverse digit span, and he's still doing very well. So he's a little over 6 years now on the protocol. And interestingly, his doctor had told me he was going to have to shut down. He had 2 different offices, one on the East Coast, one on the West Coast. He actually opened a 3rd office and he's still open. He's doing very well. Here's another woman. You can see here dramatic improvements. This is a woman who had an increase in her hippocampal volume, so you can actually look on her MRI and see improvements in the volume of an area of the brain which is hard hit in Alzheimer's disease. And then here's one more guy. This is a guy, both parents died. This is actually a brilliant physician. Both parents died with Alzheimer's disease. He had already had problems. He started with, quote, senior moments. And you can see here he had also had the ApoE4 allele, had a PET scan that showed it was markedly positive for Alzheimer's. Very typical story. Hippocampal volume already reduced. And you can see this guy, why he actually had his Alzheimer's disease. So a marker of inflammation, which is called HSCRP, actually very high. Shouldn't be over 1. His was almost 10. His homocysteine shouldn't be over 7. His was 15. So you can see why this guy got his Alzheimer's. Vitamin D was 21. You should really be more up and around 40, 50, 60, 70 up there. In fact, this is a doctor, and I said to him, what are you doing letting your vitamin D, you're a doctor, why you should be checking this? And he said, each thing I would go through, he said, that's not a cure for Alzheimer's. And I'd say, yes, I understand that, but you have to think of this like an orchestra. If you basically go out and say, look, I'm going to find the one instrument that makes the orchestra. You listen to instrument after instrument after instrument. None of them sounds like the orchestra. You have to put this together, and that's exactly the way this works. So this guy, you can see his testosterone, which should be over 500, was also too low. His thyroid was low. He responded absolutely beautifully, metabolically, cognitively. And interestingly, you can see here, if you look at his hippocampal volume, he was at 17th percentile when he started. He went up to the 75th percentile. He's doing absolutely great. And by the way, he now uses this approach for his own patients as well. Here's his gray matter volume, which actually is done by computer, and it went up by 23%. So he's done very, very well. And interestingly, this guy actually likes to cheat a little on the overall program. So what he does is he can figure it out himself. When he cheats a little bit, he begins to have a little trouble with names, and so he just adjusts it to that. If it goes more than that, then he cheats less, and if it's less than that, then he cheats a little more. So, it actually does make a difference. The first woman I showed you, by the way, went off the program 4 times because she was traveling one time, she ran out of some of the things, etc. And each time, it took about 7 to 10 days, she started having problems again and then got back on and did well. So back in 2014, we published the first paper in history that showed a reversal of cognitive decline for people who had early Alzheimer's. And then here with Alzheimer's 2016, we had more objective data, and then just in 2018, we published a paper with 100 patients that had documented improvement. And there are hundreds and hundreds now of people with improvement. There we go. And then in 2017, we published this book called The End of Alzheimer's, and we have a follow-up then coming out this year, actually on August 18th. This is now available in 31 languages. It was on the New York Times bestseller list for 5 months. And people all over are beginning to pick up on, here's a different way to look at this illness. So I'm going to show you now about why this is different than people thought it was. Why is it that you actually have to look under the hood to see this? So if you actually ask, what are these complex chronic illnesses all about? What you see, how many people here know about osteoporosis? Yeah, most people. Yeah, so this, of course, is what happens to your bones as you get older in many people, and it can make it so that you have an easy fracture of your hip. You fall down, you may fracture other bones as well. Well, the reason you get this is because as you get a little older, your bones, the cells, you can actually see the cell, that blue cell is called an osteoblast, and it makes the bone. The one on the right is called an osteoclast. It looks like a bunch of cells, but it's actually one cell with multiple nuclei. And this is just like if you have people working on your house. So let's imagine that you have one contractor who does all the building, that's the osteoblast, and you have another contractor who does all the destruction, that's the osteoclast. These things are working on your bone for your whole life, and they make it stronger. You're literally fixing things, rewiring things, just like you do with your house. Now imagine that for 20 years, in your house, the guys that did the building never showed up, and the guys that did the demolition always did a little extra. Your house would literally shrink, and that's exactly what happens with osteoporosis. Now, interestingly, with cancer, same idea, but it's reversed. The cytoblastic activity, which turns out to be from a number of genes called oncogenes, is increased because you have smoked too much, or because you've been exposed to chemical carcinogens, or because you've sat out in the sun too long, or what have you. Whereas the cytoclastic activity, and there's normally turning over, your cells actually commit suicide. If you count 2 seconds, 1 second, 2 seconds. In fact, about 1 million of your white blood cells have committed suicide during that 2 seconds. That's normal for all of us. And of course, we are making 1 million to replace them. Now, what happens if you turn off the death of the cells, you turn off the suicide, you're going to have leukemia by tonight. So there is this beautiful dance that we have with each of these diseases. And what we discovered in the lab over 3 decades is that, in fact, there's a whole set of signals that are synaptoblastic. These are the ones that we use to make and store new memories. And it has to do with everything from how you slept last night, to what you ate for lunch, to what your estradiol level is, to what your zinc status is. All these things are critical for your ability to make and store new memories. At the same time, we're actively forgetting the 7th song that played on the radio on the way to work yesterday. That's normal. You're literally keeping the most important things in your life. Therefore, what happens in Alzheimer's is that you are literally downsizing, and you are keeping the most important memories, but you're losing the ability to form new memories. What happens in your company when the budget is tight? The first thing you say to your employees is, we can't hire anybody new. That's what happens in Alzheimer's. Your brain is literally downsizing, and the first thing that goes is the ability to learn new things, because you, in fact, can do very well. We see people all the time who cannot learn new things. They're in the early stages of Alzheimer's, but they can drive, they can play tennis, they can do all sorts of things. They can do their jobs. So, in fact, this is the change. You have an increase in the synaptoclastic signaling over the synaptoblastic signaling. Okay, so we simply want to look for each person, what is driving each of these things, because in everyone with Alzheimer's, there's too much synaptoclastic for the amount of synaptoblastic. So we want to look at these, and then we want to figure out how to get people on the right side of that balance instead of the wrong side. Now, we can actually go down with a microscope and look at the center stage of this, and there is a molecule that is in your brain called APP, amyloid precursor protein. And this is actually a master switch. When things are good, in fact, when you've got enough hormones, you've got enough nutrients, you've got enough trophic factors, you're not inflamed, you're doing well, then this APP is actually cut by molecular scissors at one site, and it produces 2 fragments, SAPP alpha and alpha CTF. And this is like your CEO saying, okay, things are good, we're going to grow. Or the president saying, okay, things are good, we're going to grow. We're going to make new connections. We're going to make new interactions. And therefore, you can see there's one memo that's outside. So this SAPP alpha is outside the cell. This is the cell membrane going across here, and the CTF alpha is inside the cell. So you're literally sending out memos to say, things are good. We're going to grow and thrive. Now, imagine that things are bad. You've lost support, you've lost the nutrients, you've lost the hormones, you have ongoing wars with pathogens. Then, in fact, this same molecule gets cleaved at 3 different sites called beta, gamma, and caspase, and it produces 4 memos, 4 peptides that now signal pulling back, saying, you know what, things are not good. We literally have to fight battles. Again, no different than what a country would do. We have to fight battles. We're fighting things. We've got ongoing inflammation, and we don't have enough support from our nutrients, hormones, and growth factors to make this work. So we're going to try living with a slightly smaller neural network. And this will continue to happen as long as things are going in the wrong direction. You will keep downsizing. So in a mouse, we can fix this very easily with a simple mutation. But humans are more complicated than mice, which is one of the reasons all this work on mice has led to no drugs that really do anything very effective. So here we looked at what's called the interactome. What are all the things that interact with this APP molecule that tell it whether it's going to go the good side, making the synapses, or the bad side, pulling back? And it's just what you would guess. It's things related to hormones, to stress, to inflammation. So therefore, we need to address all of those things if we're going to make a human better. So when we first identified that there were 36 different things, I started telling the patients, okay, imagine that you had a roof with 36 holes in it. Okay? Putting a really good patch on one hole, which is what a drug does, is not going to get you a lot. It may help minimally, but it's not going to help you that much. And therefore, we have to identify where the holes are for your roof, and we have to patch each of those holes if we're going to get the best outcome. All right, here. So what this means is we have to train a new kind of physician who understands. If you look at this, the traditional Chinese physicians very good with understanding how the body and the mind connected, but they didn't understand anything about DNA. They didn't know about RNA, RNAi, exposome, metabolome, any of that stuff. The new physicians, very good. We understand DNA and RNA, things like that. But in fact, we often act as if the head was disconnected from the body. So we need to train a new kind of physician who understands, in fact, right? A new kind of physician who understands how these things work together. So we started studying a gene, ApoE, as I mentioned, the ApoE4. And this is a remarkable story because ApoE4, about 2/3 of people with Alzheimer's have ApoE4. And it's known that it ends up with Alzheimer's in many cases, but it had never been known why. What's in between those? And it turns out to be a remarkable story. So if you look back at the simians didn't have ApoE4. They essentially had an ApoE simian version. And so what happens when we went from simians to hominids? Of course, God came down, touched us with DNA, right? And a fairly small difference, as it turns out. In fact, about 99% of the chimp DNA is similar to mine. In fact, when I first told my wife that, in fact, I said, look, do you realize that a male chimp DNA is actually overall more similar to mine than mine is to yours? And she said, well, duh, all right? So, of course, the chimp likes, Three Stooges. I like the Three Stooges. The chimp likes ESPN, all that sort of stuff. So the bottom line is we're not that different. And it turns out that many of the changes between the simians and the hominids turn out to be related to a pro-inflammatory state. And actually, Tuck Finch Professor, an old friend from right over here at USC, was the one who suggested that the reason that is because what happened when we had to come down out of the trees, we were walking, right, on the savannah, we are puncturing our feet, we're fighting with our brethren, we're fighting with our food. In all of these situations, and of course we're eating food that has microbes in it, in all of these situations, we need that pro-inflammatory state to protect ourselves from these pathogens. And so, no surprise, the original one, the original ApoE was ApoE4, the pro-inflammatory one. So the very thing that we associate with Alzheimer's disease, which is here's ApoE4, it actually looks at the molecular level like the columns in your house. What happened, and that's because right here, this arginine interacted with this glutamate 255. They literally, one has a positive charge, one has a negative charge, they stick together. Now, for 96% of our evolution as hominids, everybody has been ApoE44, the thing that we associate with Alzheimer's today. Just 220,000 years ago, ApoE3 appeared, which is now the most common one. And you can see here, this cysteine, this green one, appeared. And this now interacts with the arginine 61, allowing this other piece to swing free. So they look quite different. This looks like a nutcracker, and this looks like columns. So as you can see, almost all, 96% of our time, everything has been ApoE4. Just recently, ApoE3 appeared, and then only 80,000 years ago, ApoE2 appeared. So what we found to make a 10-year story short and about a 30-second story, this thing, ApoE, what is it? It's like your butcher. It's the guy who carries the fat around. And so people thought, what the heck does that have to do with Alzheimer's disease? Well, to make a long story short, what we found is it binds to specific receptors. That had been known before. But the surprise was, after it binds, it goes in and interacts with a molecule that is related to ongoing inflammation. So if you have ongoing inflammation, this thing will interact with ApoE4. It goes into the nucleus. And interestingly, it binds to 1,700 different genes and basically slows them down. So what it does is it creates a more pro-inflammatory state. So if you have ApoE4, it's great if you're living in a third world country with squalid conditions. But if you're living in the US, it has the liability that in fact you may develop early Alzheimer's or you may develop earlier cardiovascular disease. Okay, we can fix that. We can prevent that. And there's a whole website, apoe4.info, where people over 3,000 people share information about what they're doing to prevent Alzheimer's, and most of them actually are on the protocol we developed. And if you look at these different genes, it turns out you couldn't tell a better story for Alzheimer's. They relate to inflammation in the brain, they relate to support of the brain, they even relate to aging and resveratrol, the stuff that everyone talks about with red wine. Okay, so how do we do this? So what do we do then? We use an algorithm that we developed so that we can understand what subtype. Is this mostly inflammatory or what have you? And then we start with the basics. It turns out that although I was taught in medical school that diet had very little to do with disease, that turned out to be completely wrong. It has a lot to do with disease. And no surprise. It's like saying, you took your car into the gas station. Of course, what you put in it as far as your brake fluid and as far as your transmission fluid and your gasoline and your oil, of course it has a huge thing to say about how it's going to perform. So we look at specifics of getting people on a ketogenic diet. We target typically for 1 to 4 millimolar beta-hydroxybutyrate, and all this is discussed in the book. Turns out exercise, very helpful. Exercise actually increases specific molecules in your body that support the very synapses that are lost in Alzheimer's disease. It's important to know about your sleeping. Many people have undiagnosed sleep apnea. About 80% of people with sleep apnea will go undiagnosed. It is an absolute contributor to cognitive decline. Whether you've got significant periodontitis turns out to be important as well. And then brain training. Turns out, again, brain training by itself does something, but brain training on the backbone of the optimal biochemistry does much more. And then healing your gut. Many people don't realize that they have leaky gut, and that turns out to be another contributor to cognitive decline. And then optimizing your immune system. Alzheimer's is really about making the amyloid, the 4 bad guys I showed you, the amyloid is the stuff that's actually trying to protect you from these insults. So we want to optimize your immune system. In fact, the amyloid of Alzheimer's is part of what we call the innate immune system, which is the ancient part of the immune system. So we want to find those pathogens and we want to get rid of them. And then we want to find specific toxins that you may have been exposed to, again, which doctors typically aren't looking for. They absolutely can contribute to cognitive decline. And then we want to optimize your vascular system. And how many people have heard of EWAT? So this is exercise with oxygen therapy. So you literally get on an exercise cycle and you're breathing 100% oxygen. It actually improves vascular support. And then for some people, after everything else, they may need stem cells. But again, stem cells alone, it's a little bit like trying to build a house as it's burning down. So critical information here. How many people know that the World Trade Center increased your risk for dementia? Well, I told you that a few minutes ago. California fires or coal burning in China. How many here know your ERMI score of your house? Okay, so this is the EPA. Great, one person here. So this is the EPA Relative Mold Index, actually a very helpful thing. How many people here know how many dementogens you consumed at lunch today? Okay, of course, we all know about carcinogens because of Bruce Ames, great professor at UC Berkeley. Turns out that we are all exposed to dementogens, and most of us don't know it. How many people have dementia insurance? Yeah, so we all, life insurance is common, but in fact, dementia insurance is what we really need is common. So here's the issue then for the society. If you turn on CNN, something like that, 98% of what you see is going to have to do with 2 things, commerce and politics. But there's something missing, in fact, and that's physiology. That's the third circle. In fact, yes, it's important to know about a tweet that went out this morning. Yes, it's important to know what happened to the stock market, of course. But in fact, what is affecting all of us more today is whether, in fact, we're going to get dementia, whether we are at risk for cancer, whether we're exposed to carcinogens, whether we are eating the right foods. All of these things are absolutely critical. So Alzheimer's should actually be a rare disease. I mean, it really should be. That's the bizarre thing. Something that we've been told is unavoidable should in fact be rare. And there's a tremendous amount we can all do to make it a rare disease, to make the 50 people in this room here who will die of Alzheimer's not get Alzheimer's. There are subtypes, as I mentioned. Here's the bottom line. Cognitive decline in terms of prevention and in terms of reversal can be done. It's been now published repeatedly. And this same approach should be appropriate for other complex chronic illnesses. And not only will this approach reduce the likelihood of developing Alzheimer's, but in fact it actually will make cognition better. So we are able to make people's normal cognition better with this same sort of approach. So, just as for leprosy, how many people woke up this morning worrying about leprosy? Yeah, exactly. And how many people woke up worrying about polio? Yeah. So this is the way Alzheimer's shall go, so that in the future we will not wake up in the morning worrying about Alzheimer's disease. Steve Jobs said that in fact when you connect the dots, you can only connect the dots of the past. You can't connect the dots into the future. You don't yet know where things are going. But my hope is that when people look back decades to come, we'll be able to connect the dots and to say, aha, this was when Alzheimer's disease actually started becoming less of a problem. We should be the last generation that really worries significantly about the white whale of Alzheimer's disease. Thank you.